Greetings to all my fellow Astro geeks out there. Uh, I'm Jeff Peters, and I'm starting a series that I'm putting on YouTube about some of the astrological signatures that are coming across the horizon as we go forward. And because this week, actually next week, we're going to have our first lunar eclipse in a while, I thought it would be good to just kind of dig in a bit deeper on that eclipse format. So this will be on Friday next week. I'm going to share my screen here to a little bit of a PowerPoint that I put together. Get myself out of the image there. Starting out, I basically gleaned the handle of the lively astrologer from some of my other Astro Geek friends that saw me presenting over the last number of years locally here and said, Jeff, you got to get this on video because you're just so friggin' lively. So I says, I like that handle, the lively astrologer. Anyway, we have an eclipse coming. It'll be on Friday the 5th at 12:12 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I basically have the chart cast for here in Washington. Hopefully you can see my cursor because, pointing out some things on this chart you will find of great assistance. But this is a South Node lunar eclipse. And eclipses are all about change. What is the energy that has been going on that is essentially arrived for a microscopic look at the meanings, the deeper ramifications of just what kind of changes are we considering. Well, this particular is a south node experience. You'll notice that the moon is very close to the south node down here. Anything within 17 degrees of a node, with the sun and moon being either conjunct or in opposition, is in that eclipse factor. And since this is the full moon, probably one of the first matters to consider would be, what were your intentions that you set at the Gemini new moon on Friday last week, which is the 22nd, first day of the larger participation in the NORWAC conference which normally is held in Seattle, but this year we held it out in Interland, a Zoom connection that was absolutely phenomenal. Anyway, full moon in Sagittarius. It's a T-square too. You'll notice that that Mars is over there in partile square to the axis of this eclipse. I'm gonna just jump ahead to the next thing. We'll go back to the chart, but looking at Sagittarius, what are the road signs that Sagittarius represents? Well, it's a fire sign, and it's ruled by Jupiter. That can bring about kind of enthusiasm and aspirations. Some of the types of personages that you will discover in the Sagittarius archetype are philosophers, gypsies, explorers, journalists, and reporters. It's that axis, the Gemini Sagittarius axis, has a lot to do with how we communicate and how we use our curiosity to, really push the limits. And I think pushing the limits is more the Sagittarian side of the equation. It also can stand for religion distant travel or foreigners. How many times have you had the curiosity to actually engage with people from other cultures to discover what it is that they have to offer into your understanding of what life is about from their perspective that you might be able to add into your own awareness? Uh, so fire as a fire sign, fire signs are about action. They're action-oriented things, inspirationally motivated. These are definitely Sagittarian things. And then Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, is the seeking of ultimate truth. And one of the ironies is that you will never reach that point of ultimate truth, because it's more along the lines of each step you take along that process of the investigation of the larger meaning of life brings you to a point where you kind of go, wow, that's fantastic. But, I sense there's more. And the truth of Sagittarius is there's always more. You never really will reach this theoretical ultimate truth perspective, because it's sort of like the apple hanging out there in front of the donkey, leading along the path that you use to as your motivational or your motational vehicle. Anyway, one of the things to consider as far as the challenging side of Sagittarius is that it can indicate military movements. Death or imprisonment of great men is one of the phrases I've heard, and also religious disputes, because not everything is always on the positive side. And part of that is more likely due to the fact that Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system, sometimes, in not knowing its limits, pushes beyond the level that is sustainable. Or, think of something like someone has presented you a dessert. Now, my wife makes desserts, and she presents desserts all the time that are just absolutely delicious. And you theoretically set your limits, says that, I'm going to eat one cookie, and 6 cookies later, because of the flavor of those, that lemon pistachio rosemary cookie, in your tongue. Yeah, I know your tongues are starting to drool. Mine drools just talking about it. Anyway, Jupiter will often push you beyond what might be considered the ideal limits. Back to our eclipse chart. Factors to consider in this eclipse. South nodes represent a kind of a foundational level of awareness that has served us quite well in whatever particular journey we're on. But after a season or two reaches a point where the hanging on to what it is that south nodal part of the equation represents may not be the most beneficial for going forward. I've often heard, and I tune into the idea that the nodal axis is kind of like a destiny line within the chart, where the south node represents those things that we grasp and understand relatively easily for whatever reasons. They come to us. They might show up as insights. They might show up as something that just seems like an inherent part of our makeup, that we may or may not be able to put our finger on as to just where they showed up from. And it's a resource that, if we use it correctly, will enhance the experience of what life is about as we approach the process of, the north node, which is, it kind of sits there like a good idea. It doesn't really beckon you to participate in it, but it's, it's just sitting there, kind of like that carrot hanging out in front of the donkey, you know. And as we go through life, and if we're playing into a meaningful growth perspective where we're attempting to attain more. And this, the irony of this particular lunar eclipse is that Sagittarius is the more. It is that aiming for things. So even in in looking at this lunar eclipse, even in the fact that this is a Sagittarius South Node lunar eclipse, we have to consider that, are there aspects of that big picture that we have signed on to still relevant for meaningful context as we investigate the, the Gemini perspective, where that North Node is, investigate with curiosity the more that's possible. Same idea, Sagittarius, Gemini. Sagittarius, I see the, I see the meaning of life. And the Gemini says, oh, that's kind of interesting. I have a question. Gemini curiosity. Well, we've got down there on the South Node, on the North Node, we've got a conjunction between the Sun and Venus retrograde. So Venus, and Venus is in Gemini, and this has been a signature that's been with us for a while right now. And it just recently, it came back in balance, but the process of Venus brings for our considerations, just, how do we get along with one another? And this Venus dance in Gemini, being energized by the Sun, is asking that as a deep question. Today in our world, with the coronavirus situation in play, that experience of really looking, profoundly at what is the value of the time or the energy that we spend with one another. And there's that Venus in retrograde is asking us to rethink, are the people that we have deemed important or vital in the trajectory forward that we're going on, where actually do we feel the inspiration that arises when we interact with them? This is the kind of energy that this Venus in Gemini in retrograde right now is asking us to ponder. Now, that square to Mars, partile square to Mars, Mars in Pisces. Mars is the triplicity ruler of all three of the water signs, so it's got some strength while it's there in Pisces. However, it is a sign. It's kind of interesting because Mars, everybody says, oh, Mars rules Aries. It's the warrior archetype, and it's action and impulse and everything. True, it does follow that particular archetypal scenario, but traditionally Mars was also the ruler of Scorpio, a water signs. We have fire and water there, and Mars from the Scorpio aspect is not exactly that same warrior archetype, although it could be played, possibly a little more intensely than the Aries thing. And I use that. I need to define that just a little bit more clearly for you, because the Aries Mars, the impulse to do and to stimulate action and get things going is very different from Mars in Scorpio, because Mars in Scorpio brings an intensity, because it's not just that personal I am kind of experience, Aries, wanting to get things going without necessarily having a clear plan as to where they're headed. In Scorpio, it's, you know, what it brings into the equation is, it, from the water perspective, it brings in the context of a connective vibrational uh, fabric of of very intense awareness of the interplay energetically that happens between people. That can be quite intense, because it what Scorpio archetypally brings to any equation is it brings an energy that essentially wipes out any kind of a protective veil that people try to hide behind, because it can see through that quality, that protective quality that a lot of us live behind and say, you know, I'm this type of person. And from a Scorpio perspective says, well, that's kind of, you know, cool on the surface level, but, you know, what does your soul say? Because when I tune into that soul awareness of who you are, I don't see that same outward physical manifestation that you talk about. And quite often, when people are invited to participate in the scorpionic energy field, it's not comfortable, because you do not have you do not have the normal tools that you've been trained to use to, you know, to put one over on somebody else, because you can't hide behind another reality. You know, it's all on the surface. Pisces, the last of the water signs, which is where Mars is right now, dancing quite close with Neptune, the modern ruler of Pisces, stirs the pot. You know, Mars is, it's action, it's energy. It always is. And Pisces is the most profound and deepest realm of the life investigation process that exists. And so, with Neptune having been in Pisces for quite a few years and will be there for quite a few years more, the stimulation of the process of uh, swimming in the deep end of the pool, where you no longer can touch the ground anymore. And it's ironic, because the invitation that comes from that spiritual Piscean level is asking you not just to tread water, depending on how deep it is where you are, but to dive deeper into it. It's the last sign of the zodiac. It is the clearing ground, if you will, for all the qualities that life has brought for us to, determine, where do I fit in this? What are the value things? Kind of like the Sagittarius. Oh, which reminds me, I'm going to just bounce all over the place, because that's just how I do. This particular eclipse, it's stimulating three of the mutable signs of the zodiac, which are, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. And those particular signs are all about change. They are the arenas where we take the experiences that have been transpired in each quadrant of the chart and get ready to morph into a next new cardinal reality that's about to start. Well, this Mars in that last penultimate sign of the zodiac, Pisces, very close to Neptune, is asking us, what are we actually getting ready to change into? What are we preparing for? And if you think of just the basic Aryan energy, which is, that first house signature, you're getting ready to plant a new seed that which will grow into something. And what the Pisces represents is, it represents the preparation of that seed element. And in the preparation process, things are weighed and balanced and determined as to whether they should be hung onto or jettisoned and released because they're no longer of value to the experience of what it is you want to engender in that seed as it's being presented into each new moment element. And Mars is stirring that pot. I get the image of a cauldron, which is not necessarily out of the question. It has some of the scorpionic quality to it, but from the Piscean perspective, this cauldron it's the spiritual awareness of life. Neptune is unlimited imagination and creativity. And we've got this Mars dancing very close to it that is saying, I like the idea of going for it, and actually diving deeper into that pond of awareness in this investigation process of what does it mean to interact with Source, which is essential Pisces. And, Mars stirring anything, you can almost picture that there's a certain vigorous quality to that stirring process. Now, a lot of people will take, we've got this square, at Mars sitting exactly between the sun and moon at this eclipse, and people go, oh, squares are challenging and stuff. And there are so many factors that come into there. And I have a take on that challenging aspect that a lot of people tune into. And where it comes from is that the things that are often most challenging for us are things that we're hanging on to often quite desperately for whatever reasons, and are perhaps unwilling, possibly unable, to think that they could change. There's a good fixed idea for you. And the challenge of the square, which comes from the fact that these are elements, we're talking fire and air, which elements which, work really well together, and the earth and water elements work really well together, is here we have a water sign element, which is where Mars and Neptune are dancing, dealing with a fire and air axis of the chart, which don't necessarily easily relate to one another, but we're talking Mars here. Mars has that, it has a fiery quality to it. So it can tune into that South Node full moon experience that we're having, and to add just, an extra flavor to this experience. The ruler of Sagittarius is Jupiter. And Jupiter is very much on the, let's say, on the tip of the tongue of astrological conversations these days because of its dance that it's currently doing with Pluto, which is all about, the dynamics of significant change. And Jupiter is the ruler of both Sagittarius and the traditional ruler of Pisces. So to try and remove Jupiter from this equation would be a substantial error, I think. And so Jupiter being in Capricorn is the dispositor for Mars, which means that what Mars, any planet that's in any sign, basically the ruler of that sign has something to say about the protocol of how to act while in that sign. So Mars in Pisces is asking Jupiter, or actually, I don't know if Mars, I'm having a hard time picturing Mars ever asking anybody for anything, but it's receiving a download from Jupiter saying, oh, by the way, I have this large perspective that currently I'm in Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, which is very close, it's in Aquarius, that says, there's a signature at work that as you, Mars, are stirring that cauldron of deep psychological, spiritual reality, you know, don't forget to pay attention to the vitality and value that engaging with others at a meaningful level has to play. I get images all the time when I'm talking of the vehicle that you're using to stir the pot. Is it the Neptunian trident, aglow with heat because Mars has it in its hand? Neptune there is part of that trident as well, you know, stimulating very dynamically uh, that deep resonant Pisces field. And Jupiter from the Capricorn's perspective with Pluto, which, you know, we astrologers have been talking about the Jupiter Pluto Saturn conjunction experience, which has been ongoing for quite a while now. And I don't know that I want to get into that. I would just put in like a couple bullet points, is that Pluto, not dissimilar from what I was saying about the Sagittarius reaching a limit and an apparent limit that really isn't a limit. What Pluto does wherever it is it, and being essentially stimulated by the Jupiterian ruler of Sagittarius, you know, it's very dynamically exposing us to issues and things that are often buried deep. And Pluto's function, ruler of Hades, is to reach down into what is below and hidden and bring it up for the exposure into the light of day. And Jupiter is saying to Pluto, the reason why Pluto does this is because there are aspects of being in our trajectory forward that have been placed in our paths to contain us from actually recognizing the enormity of our being, individually and collectively. See the similarity between that Sagittarian idea and what Pluto is doing? And what happens is, and people get so friggin' uncomfortable with Pluto, is because, no, you don't want to invite Pluto to the table because, you know, things will have to die. And I will have to say, absolutely. And the reason why is, you know, there are aspects of what it is that we have basically been trained to tune into that need to pass away. And the part of the reason for needing to pass away is because they act like albatrosses around our neck, holding us back, you know, weighing us down in the process of going forward, that curtail what Pluto's real function is, you know, yes, it is to allow for death to take place, but it's death and rebirth. And people seem to not have tuned into the fact that it's a complete cycle. You know, death and rebirth is the release of something that is no longer valuable to you anymore, so that it can make room for something new to put in an appearance. The rebirthing cycle as something new. You know, there's that 12th house kind of experience as well that's worked there, where, you know, when you're creating the seed element for the new experience, there are aspects of the past that are no longer vital in creating that seed, because they are holding back the creative newness of the next moment, new seed. Anyway, this square from Mars to the axis of this lunar eclipse, some will say it's a challenge, but challenges aren't necessarily always bad, because if it weren't for challenges to in place, we wouldn't build effectively the character of who we need to be. And so, yes, it is a challenge, but if you think of all the moving parts that are work at this point for this lunar eclipse, we are being asked to relinquish aspects of the past that have been holding us back. And, another thing about lunar eclipses is that an eclipse point, which here we have at 15 degrees of all the mutable signs, particularly Sagittarius, which is where the lunar eclipse is, and Gemini, where the sun is, they stay sensitive for, a number of years. From Celeste Teal, she says about 3.5 years, which I think is a good thing to keep in mind, so that over the next 3.5 years, the sun's going to go over that a few times. The moon goes over it every month, but as the time period, as the sun is traveling along, it's bringing along Venus and Mercury with it, and those planets are going to go. And in that 3.5 years, Mars is going to go over it. And every time something touches, well, right now Mars is touching one of those quarter cross points, or the 90-degree angle points is another term for it. It'll come to me. Anyway, the energy that we tune into for this particular lunar eclipse, which is, there will be a solar eclipse happening a little bit later on in the month. Usually they happen 2 weeks later after. So 2 weeks, 14, 25, 29, 21, 19. It's happening, 2 weeks after the lunar eclipse, there will be a solar eclipse, because you'll see the sun will be a lot closer to the nodes and the moon will be dancing. It will be, oh yeah, I know, it'll be on the summer solstice, when the sun crosses into 0 degrees Cancer. So we will discuss that later. We don't need to get into that right now. But next chart. No, okay. In looking at at any chart, the idea of paying attention to what's going on in the heavens is it's a vital clue as to what the energies that any particular chart starting out would have. And last night during my weekly astrological group meeting, we looked at the lunar eclipse chart compared to everybody in the group's chart, just to see what was going on. But, in bouncing around and looking at charts, I came up with, what about the Sibley chart? What's going on in America right now that might have some considerations? But before I put the two charts together, there's a process called dispositorship. And in the dispositorship program that I learned, the focus has been on the modern rulership of these planets. So like Uranus rules Aquarius, Pluto rules Scorpio, Neptune rules Pisces. And in that, it's a rulership thing. But what dispositorship does is it sets up should we call it a pecking order of how the planets actually communicate with one another in the context of the celestial surround that we are, with any luck, tuned into more or less. I must have touched the screen. Anyway, this dispositorship patterns, there are a lot of different kinds of patterns. There's a final dispositor pattern, which is kind of like a locomotive, where one planet, and usually the planet will be in its own sign, because every time a planet is in the sign that it rules, it is a final dispositor, which gives it strength. And you can have this long line where everything feeds into that one planet, or you can have a split pattern where you'll have a mutual reception between this planet, and you'll have a circle of infinity, which is another type, and you'll have another final dispositor thing going on over here. That's known as a split pattern, where you don't have all the planets actually engaged in the same conversation at the same time. Well, when I looked at the US chart, what I basically do this with just about every chart that I look at, almost right off the bat. As I say, how are the planets talking to each other? And what we have here with the US chart is we have a circle of infinity, which means we have the moon is in Aquarius, and it's disposited by Uranus, which is in Gemini, which is disposited by Mercury, which is in Cancer, which brings us back around to the moon in Aquarius. And this is the final dispositor of the US Sibley chart. It's a circle of infinity, and how a circle of infinity works is that those planets involved in that round robin circle of infinity, they are activated simultaneously in any consideration. So as far as the US chart goes, the moon, how we feel, Uranus, what is our recognition of the humanitarian connection that we have with one another, and Mercury, how do we communicate effectively with one another? Those things happen, simultaneously, and everything else in the chart, every other planet is basically in the pecking order of, is feeding into that circle of infinity. So like if you wanted to, you say, what's the Pluto factor in the chart, and where we look for Pluto? Pluto's down here in the second house in Capricorn. Also coming to, we're very close to the Pluto return in our chart right now. It's coming shortly, within the next couple of years. In order for Pluto to talk, Pluto sends its message through Saturn, which is in Libra, which sends its message through Venus, which is in Cancer, which brings it into the moon in the circle of infinity. So you can kind of see that there could be a translation of the message that Pluto sent out that, Saturn-wise says, how can we make it meaningful? Is there a context to it? What can we learn from it? And brought into the Venus factor is like, can we set up some sort of a partnership or artistic matrix within which this can transpire? And then that feeds into the moon. As soon as the moon gets a hold of it, the moon takes and spins it through Uranus and Mercury and says, how do we communicate this reality in a sensitive way, moon, that we can be on the same page with what we need to do? And you can see the moon is fed in here by the sun and Jupiter feeding right into the moon. Mercury, the only other planet in the circle of infinity that's actually being directly influenced by the other planetary energies, is being influenced by Neptune and Mars. Because Mars is in Gemini and Neptune's in Virgo, which are ruled by, are disposited by Mercury. So we get a flavor when we look at the US chart that says that the Uranus, which we have here almost on the descendant, the Pluto, which we have here in the second house, and Mercury, which we have up here in the eighth house, these are critical points of the factor of how the US works. I would go to, just to look at the Uranus sitting here almost at the descendant, is which brings in automatically the Mercury eighth house and the Pluto second house, which are, the Mercury and the Pluto are kind of very close to an opposition with each other. They're separating because of the retrograde motion of Mercury, but it's across that axis of personal ownership and shared ownership, second and eighth houses, and the signs of Cancer and Capricorn, which are, home and business, or home and government kind of energies that are, in a very dynamic, potentially intense interaction with each other, but, you know, they're Cancer and Capricorn. They are the energies of mom and pop, our parent. There's a parental flavor there to work with those. This Uranus on the second house would be more inclined, in the Gemini, would be more inclined to say that the vitality of what it is that America stands for at a communication level that we share with the whole world is, you know, has a partnership flavor to it, because it's right there on that, right almost on the descendant. So it's bringing in the awareness of the humanitarian capability of how we interact with each other. And you can kind of look at, just thinking back to the American history of how that has played out over time, that, you know, we were the melting pot of, one of the melting pots of the world where everybody wanted to come to, because of what it is that our particular system was offering as opportunity for, you know, the land of the free, and, you know, so many other places. Anyway, that's the flavor of the Sibley chart that I look at. It's, well, by the way, it also starts out with Sagittarius on the ascendant, which means that Jupiter is the ruler of this chart. Jupiter up here in Cancer, in, you know, sitting sitting in between the Sun and Venus in the seventh house is in Cancer. You know, home. Can you picture home being an essential quality of the American way? You know, uh, the home, you know, is your castle kind of experience. And Jupiter in Cancer being energized by the vitality of the Sun to, you know, recognize home as being a place where people can come together in partnership, and a place where, you know, I think of the Libra term of companionship, those you break bread with. That kind of energy for the US is in play. We have Saturn up here in Libra in the 10th house. Saturn, very comfortable in the 10th house because it rules Capricorn, which is normally the flavor of this house. It's in Libra, and there's our Venus connection over there in the 7th house again. It's Libra. America in partnership is probably one of the ideal tools, and because of the time frame of when this was put together, I would hazard a, you know, a scenario that the partnership that was being talked about as this chart was drawn up for that moment when we it literally became a nation on paper, was the partnership between those in control, 10th house, and the people. You know, ideal partnership that is required, you know, it's Libra. There has to be that level of partnership where, you know, we the people, you know, it's not we the government are here to control you. It's we the people. We have the power invested in us to be the controlling agent for what needs to transpire going forward. Okay, enough of that chart. Now, here's the Sibley chart with the eclipse chart around it, and I put some arrows on it to show the axis of the sun and moon, and also I put an arrow here to show where Mars is. And I put a little star here to make sure that we didn't forget Jupiter in the equation. Well, first off the bat, I look at the chart and what I say is, whoa, look, this lunar eclipse is on the ascendant of the US chart. You know, are there things that are due for some change? You know, I don't have to go into all the details of what it is I talked about the actual lunar return chart. They're being essentially placed around the Sibley chart, America as we intended it to be when we started out. And, you know, right off the bat, we see that the South Node lunar eclipse is on the ascendant of the US chart, which brings in our Jupiter. You know, Jupiter is important. And what do we have? We have Jupiter sitting on natal Pluto and transiting Pluto very, very close to that same reality. You know, this in the second house, here is the arena of ownership. Second house is so we have the U.S. ownership idea. Saturn, the ruler of this house, is also in that house. There are factors of, uh, you know, that probably supersede or go beyond just the experience of personal ownership. This is personal ownership, second house, but what does personal ownership mean as an America? It's being stimulated by this Pluto return that's happening right now, and Jupiter is, and the Jupiter-Pluto equation, which I talked about before, is asking some very dynamic questions as to how are we going to play this reality. And we know, of course, that Mercury up there in the eighth house is opposing that from the natal perspective, you know, and the eighth house is, you know, it's the house of deep questions. It's the house of investigations, the house of the detective and sleuthing work. It's, you know, there's a, you know, and it's asking questions about, is the shared energy or the shared ownership process still being honored as a part of the American, you know, I was going to say capitalist system. I'm going to say capitalist system, and I would have a question about that. You know, my gut tells me that, and I majored in economics, and I, you know, fought the economics professors tooth and nail when I was doing it because they were teaching theories that, you know, were wrong, short-sighted. And the comeuppance of that is that we are currently in a reality change aspect that is asking us to do some deep soul searching as to what is the real value that we as a modern culture have at our avail, and how are we going to use it. The Mars square coming from down here in the third house with Neptune is tuning into or asking the question from the square aspect, hard questions about, you know, are we communicating effectively with each other? You know, is there are there deeper qualities of the investigation of what it is that we need to talk about that should be on the table? And I think that there are, that we are, you know, in the process of tuning into. We are right now in a Neptune opposition that's taking place. Looks like the screen is so small, I have a hard time seeing. Get out the magnifying glass, Jeff. You probably can't see it either. Yeah, opposition that's taking place. So that creative field of unlimited imagination, you know, is being stimulated across that ninth, third house axis. How is the curiosity factor, and are we paying attention to what are the larger lessons of life? Virgo, where the natal Neptune is up there in the ninth house of the US chart, it's the mentor. Virgo is the mentor, and the mentor is attempting to utilize whatever is at its avail to teach us something. And it's not the kind of, you know, ram it down your throat teacher technique, because a good mentor will basically offer you opportunities or challenges to investigate yourself and see how the pieces fit together. And since this is a Neptune consideration that we're having, the field of investigation across that Virgo Pisces axis is, it wants us to ponder the difference that exists between being a servant or slave consciousness, which is a potential from the Virgoan side, to that of really being of service, which is the Piscean side, which, you know, you can kind of see the energies flow across that axis, and it's just a matter of how we're stepping with that interactive axis energy as to just where along that spectrum we fit. You know, is is your 9 to 5 of such a nature that you feel like you're actually providing a meaningful service to others, or is it more along the lines that like you feel like you're a slave to the clock and the dollar, you know? Or is it that Piscean perspective where being of service is of such a nature that you feel like you have no other choice other than to be available for the interaction experience that can transpire between one another? I'm having the sun beating down on me from the skylights here. I didn't know what was going to happen when I started this. Anyway, that is kind of some of the flavor that leaps off the page at me when I considered this lunar eclipse and the US chart that I think is of value for us, because the sun is just entered into the, in this lunar eclipse, entered into the 7th house. And so the vitality in Gemini, the vitality of, or maybe it's an answer or a direction to consider for how best to play out this lunar south node eclipse energy as it goes forward through the next number of years, is to recognize that the sun's position over there right at the beginning of the 7th house on the descendant is the invitation to make sure that, you know, our partnership connection, which, you know, the irony of it is that we have to take into consideration what were the founding fathers attempting to, what level of partnership was this Saturn in the 10th house really aiming at? And the sun on this axis being right there in the 7th house it can act as a reminder to us in a north node kind of way to see, you know, are there meaningful contexts to our position on the world stage that we are playing effectively right now and could use, you know, some support, some change, some added level of communication about this? Is in Gemini, by the way, honest communication with one another across cultural lines. And anyway, eclipses are about change. And that's the last chart that I have on this. I'm going to stop my share. And thank you for your participation. I'm going to be putting this out on my YouTube line for further consideration. And Alahala Kokopelli dance to keep your thoughts from settling too much, because there's a lot of percolating factors that are in play right now that we need to engage with one another meaningfully as we experience what the changes could and can be.